Alright, welcome to hopefully a clean video. There's a lot of reasons why this video is going to fail. Mostly because of the topic, mostly because the search metrics will never allow you to find it. So if you're watching this right now, I'm going to start with a congratulations. A lot of Chewy users will actually say thank you. And so, whilst I'd like to be so good and gracious as to say thank you as I'm winding the video up, due to a range of reasons why we're going to have a tech fail, no doubt, at some point during the recording of this video. Let's get that out of the way right now. We should say thank you. So, look, just to not make me a disembodied voice, apologies, I'm going to point the camera around on myself. Well, a little bit hard to do. Oh, I can see myself there. Well, as you can see, I'm out of focus a little bit. I'm not a fake AI video. The reason I'm out of focus is I'm using a third-party camera recording app, and it's set to infinity focus. The reason I'm using a third-party camera recording app is many and varied, but those stupid glasses you see on my face, they allow me to two things. So the reason I'm using them is that they're two microphones up close to my head that should ideally capture the sound that's in between them quite precisely. But also it does allow me to see what I'm framing with the camera, separate to where I'm looking. So for example, right now I could technically film that trunk while I'm walking directly up the hill. Now, the biggest weakness of this video, apart from the fact that it's a non-scripted dialogue rant, is the fact that I am walking technically up a very steep hill. So apologies for my heavy breathing. This isn't a special 1-800 number that you've called to listen to heavy breathing. It's fair to say in post-production I haven't come in and run a filter and cleaned up my act a little bit. But every so often I will stop and pause. Partly because the missus told me to bring a walking stick up with me. And it is a really steep hill. So already, there are the houses down below us. Probably climbed my own height about 20 or 30 times. If I was to do that on a ladder, I'd probably be nearly out of breath. Certainly the arms would be a bit warmed up. We're starting to get to the top of some of the hills out here. I'm using manual exposure controls. We should have a pretty good video feed. I've set the bitrate quite high. Alright, so look at that. We can only guess a couple of minutes in on our recording now, and I haven't even broached the topic for which it should be listed as, for the same reason I believe you will not find this video. The problem with internet information at the moment is it's so easy for AI to auto-generate content, and there's an information war going on in our infotainment spheres. And that is to say that if you go to a web browser and don't log in, don't give it any information on who you are, and then do a generic search for information on, say, the gaming industry, you will be auto-fed a lot of positive information regarding the Microsoft Xbox. And even if you do a specific search regarding the other platforms, generally the lion's share of at least 3 out of the top 10 hits will be Xbox first websites. And don't for a second think that some of your PlayStation sites or your Nintendo sites are in any way Nintendo or PlayStation sites. They're not. They're actually run by Microsoft, or they are pro-Microsoft. They've been taken over, or they have been set up to control the information feeds that you get. And then of our leading journalists, quite a few of them are very much in the paid-for camp. Some of them have actually claimed autonomy, and that they've bought back their ability to be free and independent. And I actually see, when you go to dedicated hardcore tech web pages, they post an article up that's neutral in tone or in any way positive to, say, a tech feature as found on the PlayStation console, they will get ripped. That is to say, 90% plus of the comments that are thrown at them will be very much pro Xbox and very much... It's easy to say pro PC. Everyone wants to justify the value of their PC. The problem is the people leading the charge on the disinformation that's available en masse are very much paid for shills in a Microsoft ecosystem. And they're essentially doing damage control. And they've been doing it now for many, many years. It's going to take regular pauses. Okay, so a moment ago, I was sort of down there, and I've now climbed another 20 times my height. An incredibly steep mountain. If I get anywhere near the top, I'll have gained 400 metres in height from where we were, which was about 300 metres above sea level. It's really nice. Alright, so the problem with the misinformation, I'll get my breath back so there's actually some clear audio. The web pages that are misrepresenting this have chosen that instead of aligning with a company that's built a better product or something that's in any way pro-consumer, they've just deemed that the only stance they've got left to take is to control the misinformation and to actively program the general population's mind to have an attitude. And you can say, oh, but Microsoft is pro-PC and that, you know, it's just a failing of Windows at the moment, but the PC platform is something that they wanted to support. It's like, no. Microsoft desperately needed to sell Xboxes and did everything it could to kill the PC platform. Now put the lens back on me for a bit, and you can just make sure that the audio feed is synced with my lips. Oh, how do I get myself in frame? There we go. No, how's that? Right. So again, I've set the focus to infinity focus. So I'll just turn it around. Oh, where have we got? I mean, it's an alright background there, isn't it? Got a stick pointing in my eye. Right, so about the year 2012, Microsoft had put out another console that was doing very badly in the sales market, and they wanted Game Pass. They had a strategy which would be to move gamers to Xbox, and so with everything that was coming with Game Pass was the potential that Games Pass would also work on PC, but used in a way as to migrate customers to the console where games would just work better. And I've been a PC technician for many, many decades, and a focus on high-end optimization for gaming, much in the way of overclocking, and I've been tweaking games since, well, before NVIDIA made video cards. So, well, Riva TNTs were probably my fourth video card, and that was before the GeForce first version. At which point in the market I had all players. I've generally had most of the market players, but I speak this information as a PC technician who's run many a computer business, either for other people or certainly for myself since being a young teenager. The understanding where the PC hardware is at and the deprecation that Windows, firstly 10 and then Windows 11 really enforced, and it was just through little tricks like adding massive latency to the controller inputs, which for the uninformed will make a 30 frame a second game on a console with less latency to the input actually feel as responsive as like 100 frame a second on a PC with lots of latency to the input. And so there's lots of little tricks that they've had because they've had control of the operating system for which people's games are played on. And it started with the antics like a lack of full screen mode, everything being rendered in a window which cuts off a little bit of a percentage of the effectiveness of your gaming PC or dedicated gaming hardware that you spend a lot of money on. And their main battle was with RAM, filling your system RAM and optimizing so your system RAM would autofill for utilities you would never use, such that the gaming data would have to be constantly streamed in and out of main system RAM. And if they encrypted that gaming data and made it so that you had to decrypt it on the fly using your CPU, they could bog down really powerful CPU systems and generate lots of bottlenecks that the system wouldn't have had if they weren't being anti-consumer. Very much anti-competitive. Because, and just to deal with the elephant in the room, and yes, I haven't got to the topic of FSR 4.1 or PSSR 2, but the reason why Microsoft needed to sell consoles was to generate income. All right, so if they sell a console, if any company sells a console, they lose money quite often, or potentially in earlier generations they certainly did, on the console hardware. They would then recoup that on further sales. So if Sony make their games for their console, it doesn't need to be ported to the PC. That was a great move in a chess strategy to stop gamers migrating to Xbox when their PC Games Pass games were running like shit, and everyone's going, well, I'll just get an Xbox. It just plays better, right? If Sony were releasing their games on PC, it justified people sticking out the PC ecosystem. That's not a strategy they need to play anymore. So that chess move, a good one, they can let that one go, because they obviously want to get people into their own ecosystem, because the nature of selling consoles, you sell licensed peripherals, you get sales from every software title sold on your platform through your store. You get, well, in the case of Microsoft, it's licensed storage, which has actually been one of the areas that they've actually made profit. And that's why they put the Series S and the Series X game with different size textures. But they make it so when you download the game, you actually download both texture packs, because it just wastes your storage space, and then they sell you new drives. When they bring those games to other platforms, they don't change up the fact they're giving you two sets of textures on the PS5 version of the game. Although the Switch, they're putting out Indiana Jones on the Switch, and they can obviously just give one texture size with that, so they can actually afford to fit it on one cartridge, which are allowed to go up to 64 gig in size. So that one there will have its size basically halved. Yay! But there's other income streams. Annual network costs you get. There is more. I'm a bit sidetracked, I guess, with my walk. I don't really want to linger on educating people on basic facts. There's a pretty good chance anyone watching this actually knows this stuff. If anyone's actually watching this, I doubt they will, especially because of my slow lead-in. But I do this mostly because it's easy to generate AI detritus. And the nature of providing information is you basically need to qualify where you're coming from, or whether you have an opinion that's worth hearing on said topic. Now, this is original thought. This isn't repeated based on other people's misobservations or lack of understanding. And as the great scientists kind of figure out that once we hit this AI stage in life, that the internet will basically revert back to being, once we don't trust the information it provides en masse, it falls back to a state of being useful just for cat videos again. Entertainment, pure and simple. We're basically at that stage now. And so I encourage anyone that watches YouTube videos to put in a filter, like -AI, or just do something so that your viewing time supports actual content creators, and people who are willing to put themselves with a natural voice on a microphone or on a camera for your entertainment. As I say, it's very easy to generate 10 times more garbage re-spewing viewpoints that you are basically being programmed to believe. Now, as a PC technician of many decades, I game on console. Now, I game on console because of the way the gaming PC platform went. Now, I am someone who can service my own machine. It doesn't cost me anything to rotate out hardware that breaks, or to service a bad driver update, or to rebuild my machine, or troubleshoot games that won't work very well versus the console equivalent. Dare I say, my channel here started with a video on getting a Microsoft game on PC working, where I basically had to set its program affinity to be the lowest, which is the opposite of how Microsoft wants you to set things. I had to turn my page file back on as someone who'd been using top-end SSDs, solid-state drives for years, like Gen 1 with SLC, single-level cache, like they were very, very quick in terms of their access times. But I had to, and even with 16 or 32 gig of RAM, I had to turn on a page file because the game had been optimized at every level to not work well on PC. Something that it would actually optimize the game anytime there was a change. It detected, it would re-optimize itself, a process that would take easily 8 minutes, and then it would reset all the game settings to not be optimal and run at 30 frames a second, so that your experience was no better than a console, which is, I had to buy it for console. I couldn't physically buy the game for PC. And they counted all Windows 10 installs as Xbox licenses, Xbox installs, so they could misrepresent themselves to the market to hopefully get software written for them. So we haven't actually really seen software written for the PS5 yet. It's a vastly superior system to the Xbox, irrelevant of what anyone tells you. People who don't understand, or people that are selling you a misrepresentation of the facts, will have dramatically missed of just how optimized Sony has yet again. PS4 they didn't. It was basically a off-the-shelf PC. It was the first time either of the companies, certainly on the Sony side, turned profit on selling of the hardware in a reasonably small amount of time, because it didn't need the clever research and development and re-engineering that they'd certainly given all their previous consoles, which were basically all supercomputers. That was why they couldn't do backwards compatibility, and certainly with the low-powered capability of the PS4, you can't backwards compatibility, you can't emulate a supercomputer with a lesser powered computer. So Sony's always wanted to do backwards compatibility. Microsoft's always had a super easy time with it. It's actually become their bullet point sales feature. When they've got nothing else to offer, it's like, hey, we've just speed bumped a computer and sold you a new one without having to do much re-engineering or do anything clever. So it's super easy for us to allow you to have backwards compatibility with the generation before this. Whereas Sony were always engineering basically supercomputers. The different stages of their releases, you couldn't actually sell them into some market territories because of fears from, apparently, government departments that things would get repurposed for warfare. Missile guidance systems, etc. Just like low power consumption, affordable, very powerful computing capabilities. So the PS5 was re-engineered. People make out like it doesn't have full RDNA 2. It didn't. But that doesn't mean a reductionist philosophical logic of, well, that means it's RDNA 1 point something. It was actually the opposite. They'd forward thinking, taken aspects of what was going to be RDNA 3, and it was the early Z-cull. What a Z-cull is Z, if you've got your dimensions, say X and Y, Z is the depth dimension. And an early Z-cull looks at the information you can't see. For example, the other side of that log lying on the ground there. If you were rendering that in a 3D space, that would be made up of polygons, triangles, that you cannot see. And there's no point putting them through the video display pipeline and doing all the light sourcing and all the tricks that the video card is doing on them, because that data will never make it to the screen. And that's how video cards work. They actually process all that extra information. Up until RDNA 3 came along with one of its feature sets being an early Z-cull, something that had sort of been co-optimized with, I believe it was Sony innovation, but it was certainly what they were looking at in the future of the new AMD silicon, and went, we want that. And so the re-engineered PS5 architecture, that's why in those early games that weren't optimized for either platform, anything with open area, anywhere with indoor-outdoor environments, anywhere where it benefits to not have a whole bunch of polygons or triangles in the room outside you or on the other side of foliage and nature, things that were quite tricky to render because of the sheer number of triangles that make them up. And anywhere in those zones, it would just be so much easier. To the ballpark, it was about a 40% uptick with RDNA 3 versus the generation before it on the PC space, when utilised correctly. Now, this is going to be an important part of the video, because when utilised correctly, it's going to come down for why it is that even over FSR 4.1, that PSSR 2 outshines DLSS. Now, That's a pretty controversial statement to make right there. But it does come down to the concept of when optimized for. You must remember that PC is quite niche versus the sheer install base of solid platforms to program for, right? So console optimization, this nature of to the metal, and do consoles punch above their weight? Well, yes, they do. And it's been a thing ever since the original PlayStation, where if you were to compare, well, probably before that, but I'll give an example of Colin McRae Rally running on the original PlayStation, a machine with only 2 megabytes of RAM and no dedicated 3D hardware acceleration chip. Right, it was a multi-purpose CPU, 33 megahertz. It was probably RISC rather than CISC, such that 33 megahertz is actually probably more potent or powerful than people give it credit to be. But versus a Pentium MMX of a couple of hundred megahertz of nature with a dedicated 3D accelerator card, and sorry there for the sharp tone of my voice that might make it feel like this is an AI reading a text document, but it certainly isn't. I'm just passionate. The nature of Colin McRae Rally rendering at 640 by 480 resolution on a PC, which was basically double the resolution, and you might have got maybe double the frame rate. But versus the lowly console, which didn't need a couple of megabytes of dedicated VRAM and didn't certainly need 16 megabytes or 8 megabytes of system RAM to punch out basically the same game. Now, there was no gameplay differences. If you argue that frame rate is gameplay, no, not really. And then you can argue in the competitive space if you can buy an advantage, right? If it was pay to win, conceptually, pay to win being the person with the 500 hertz monitor and a PC worth twice as much as the other person's PC that is already 5 times the cost of a PlayStation. Sure, if we're talking here about having a millisecond or 3 millisecond advantage over someone in terms of recognizing them on a screen and then being able to put your cursor over them and being able to shoot them. Right, this is actually will feed back into why paying a network cost to have a gaming ecosystem with a lot more players who qualifiably aren't cheating and are all on equal footing is actually a much more fun environment. And I say this as many decade PC technician who's always run PCs of generally the highest caliber and at the highest refresh rates and always with the epic graphic settings on. I play on console and I prefer the experience, hands down. Partly because I get my time back. I'm not fighting with my PC. Something that Forza Horizon 3 showed me was that on a Saturday morning, which was my gaming time, where I might give myself a couple of hours of driving around a car in an open world environment before getting into the housework of a morning, I consistently found myself on a weekend basis serving my PC for at least 30 minutes to get the game up and running. And with such little gaming time available to me as a grown adult, I actually found that migrating to consoles just basically tripled my gameplay time on a weekly basis because of not having to fight a machine. And I say this as a qualified PC tech who can get on top of these issues quicker than the average person, that the PCs were fast becoming a very anti-consumer platform, intentionally. Because as you'll see a unified statement across all of Microsoft's executives where they're saying it's just better. I think they're trying to say play it on Xbox. It's like the platform where it's meant to be played or something. There's some unified statement they're all using where they're basically acknowledging that their push has been, it's about comfort, right? You can turn your console on, you can just get it working. And it just works. So that was their push to get people off PC. Now, you can spend a lot of money on a PC and you can get thereabouts equal to a console. But I say thereabouts equal because it does come down to the re-engineering of these technologies, right? I was alluding there to the PS5, that we haven't actually seen many or any games written to make use of it. And so Returnal's a good example where the developers Housemarque or Housemarque, I don't know how it would be pronounced. If you look back to their Super Stardust type games, or I don't know if that was one of theirs, but they were always doing arcade shooters, and it was evident that their programming team knew how to get lots of special effects loaded onto the screen in a way that was super impressive, right? And so that's all Returnal was ever going to be, but it was technically in 3D. So it actually pushed, for as far as their games went, it was graphically a bit of a powerhouse. But it was, anyone who was buying the game knew that just to expect bullet hell and dodging, like per the rest of their games that they'd always made. The fact that people refer to it as a bit of a graphics powerhouse, of course, a PC can brute force that in higher resolution and higher frame rates, right? They weren't a first-party Microsoft company when they were making that game, and they are a small team. But what they were setting out to achieve certainly didn't push the PS5's capabilities in any meaningful way. And beyond a couple of first-party Sony developers who haven't really put out second-wave and third-wave titles, maybe Spider-Man 2. But we haven't seen a lot of, generally where consoles have always pushed strongly, is in their second wave of titles when the developers who've made now multiple bits of software for said platform have learnt how to squeeze it out. Now, to quote, I believe it was Bungie when they were making Halo 2, they put out some quote, this is not verbatim, but they said, oh, Halo 2 is like driving an ambulance through a 40 zone with all of its sirens blaring and blah, blah, blah. And then it's being attacked by ninjas, and the ambulance is on fire, and heck, the ninjas are on fire. And it was just, they were trying to set this example up of, if you thought our first game was good, now we're absolutely pushing everything to be just more capable, more dramatic. Now, personally, I didn't find it anywhere near as open world zones. You could see that they knew the render distance. It wasn't a game that had been written for Mac platform that Microsoft had bought, so they could single-handedly remove a competitor, which was basically the best first-person shooter game you'd find on in the Apple ecosystem. But also they needed a crown jewel for their own platform. So when they acquired Halo, it was a couple of things in one swift move. But the first game was written for open world. It was written for much larger RAM. It was everything about it would have been written for a more capable, more powerful system, generally speaking. Because the problem with building for PCs or any personal computing platform is, of course, that you've got a range of specs. And if you want to sell the game, you need to be able to sell into all of those specs. And if this notion that Steam has more games than will ever be available on console, well, I mean, this is kind of Xbox ecosystem stuff and PC ecosystem stuff when we lean into these things, right? Now, for example, let's just deal with one of the elephants in the room. The PS4 library alone had more titles in it than all of the Xbox generations going back to the first Xbox. So when the PS5 could first do backwards compatibility with PS4 games, there was actually more backwards compatibility on offer than what Xbox offered. But of course the media didn't present that, did it? It made out like getting games from the 90s that were written for TV ratios and resolutions that wouldn't look good on modern screens, that required a response time that was much faster than any of the modern screens could do, as in just a different era of gaming. And then getting remasters of those games over multiple platforms and calling all of those multiple titles as, well, there's 3 titles in our backwards compatibility library. It's like as if you're going to go back and play the non-remaster of a game when there's a remaster that comes out in widescreen at twice the resolution. So it's a little bit fake, but the total numbers still in the Microsoft camp with backwards compatibility to the first Xbox wasn't that powerful. Wasn't that much. Steam, same deal. If you factor in the fact that the lion's share of PC games come from the 80s and 90s and earlier generations where a video card that doesn't have 5% the power of a good video card from 4 years ago and a video card with 5% the power of a good video card from 4 years ago can run the vast catalogue of PC games ever made. That is to say, a budget laptop without even a good graphics gaming chip in it can run the vast catalogue of games, a lot of which we saw turn up on Nintendo Switch, the first one. Switch 2 will now be able to offer basically a decade's worth of gaming catalogue newer. So, I mean, the Switch kind of has its place in everybody's lounge room. Switch 2, I should say, will offer a lot of games for people who haven't experienced, say, PC games through the decades. But let's just look at that other elephant in the room, which is games that can run on a video card with 5% the capability of a high-end PC video card from 4 years ago. Right? So that is to say that every PC game for many, many, many decades can be absolutely maxed out in frame rate, in resolution, in all graphic settings, and you could actually do that on a super, super low-powered, not even a gaming laptop, right? Because in the PC space, nobody's going to write for a couple of % of video card sales. If you look at the average Steam hardware install, they've got their statistics. The reason why the Steam machine is not punching up as high as a PS5 base model is intentional, because that still allows compatibility with a library going back for forever, and it allows it to be an affordable system that runs cool and quiet, doesn't need bulk power supply, bulk cooling systems, much larger chassis, which is more costly to ship around the world, etc., etc. Right? They've intelligently chosen a metric that they might actually be able to spit out at a cost-effective price tier, which is what allows adoption. Right? Just look at the Nintendo Wii outselling the Sony and Microsoft systems at the time. Right? Just be the cheapest by a large margin will get you under the tree at Christmas time. Right? The Xbox Series S's only strategy, which they never played for some stupid reason, is when they realised they'd lost the war with the Xbox Series X, they actually went to their hardware partners and said, well, what can you manufacture that at the next die shrink we can sell for absolutely super cheap? And the hardware partners looked and went, look, that RAM configuration is going to be messy. If we can get you down to, say, 4 gigabytes less RAM, it'll be a nice, neat number that's easy to manufacture in terms of buses on a more generic board, and we can do this for a die shrink and blah, blah, blah. And the Xbox Series S was designed, but not because of yielding needs of gaming, but because of we need a slinky plan B, which is to just be the Nintendo Wii, outsell the competitors at such a significant amount that it keeps us in the gaming industry. It didn't work for them. They forgot to play that card. They didn't do a cut-down super budget Series S console that they sold for peanuts price points, so that everybody put one under the tree with a Games Pass model. They should have. It's a bit late for that now. Everybody's lost faith. But yeah, I mean, that's the big thing. Now Microsoft's folded. Sony don't have to put their games on PC. So this whole video is relevant. For the lion's share, the meat and potato, the whole reason I've been doing this big slow lead-in is to get to the part where we talk about PSSR 2, essentially the PS5 Pro. But we need to deal with the fact that the base model PS5 has never really been optimised for, and that a lot of its tricks, such as the early Z-Cull, actually allowed it to punch generally about 20% more capably than the Xbox Series X, which by the spec sheet was technically 20% more capable at a GPU part than the base PS5. But Microsoft did it yet again by mismatched buses and all sorts of just nightmarically hard things to program for in order to squeeze out that technical spec sheet paint by numbers number that they'd achieved, which was just to garner consumer interest, be the more impressive on paper. And it worked. And the hardware partners, the advertising partners leaned in on it heavy, without anybody talking up just how customised the PS5 silicon actually was. Now, a large part of that is the super fast solid-state drive, which we've not seen yield results outside of even a handful of titles, mostly because a de-optimised strategy by Microsoft and its partners, the same thing we'll see come into the battle with the PSSR first generation of titles, where all their menus were crippled, where they pulled out menu options they previously had, which would have allowed people to use the PS5 Pro without the de-optimised PSSR implementation they'd been given to absolutely make the system look like it wasn't going to shine. Right? They buried the PS5 Pro on launch because of Microsoft's reach in the industry is actually quite powerful. Anyway, getting back to hardware partners, a lot of games companies lent on the 100 megahertz stronger Xbox CPU with drive decompression. So rather than using files written in a Kraken format, which would actually make use of the PlayStation Super Advanced SSD with an inbuilt controller chip of high capability, right? So this is important because if you're on PC gaming space and you don't understand and you think you can build a budget PC that is equal to a PS5, you can't, right? All those numbers where they say, oh, look, if you buy some second-hand parts and you do this, you do that, and you put in a half-size drive of budget nature, you don't include a controller, and you don't include Bluetooth, and you don't do this, and you don't do that. You could maybe only for a couple $100 more get a machine that technically by the numbers might sound more impressive than a PlayStation. But the difference of having a high-powered controller chip is everything. That's why Microsoft has made so much money selling Xbox storage. It's because they don't include a controller chip. They sell it the world's dumbest SSD drive at full price as if it's got a Pro controller chip. That's where they make their money. But that means they have to lean on the CPU for decompression of the blocks. Right? SSDs were expensive, consumers didn't want to pay for them, so we just compressed the data that was going to them more and more and more and that brought the price point down because you could put half as many chips in the drive each time you decided to compress the data times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5, right? All of a sudden SSDs were affordable and consumers started to buy them. But they had bigger latencies and they lent on the CPU in a big way. If I put a game like Hogwarts on my PC and put a budget SSD as the drive that the game is sitting on, I can actually watch 2 or 3 cores of nearly 5 gigahertz in speed get bottlenecked down just doing decompression of the data on the fly. That's how costly it is. If you've got a dedicated CPU or a dedicated controller chip handling the decompression of data, that frees your CPU up, right? All of a sudden, the PS5, which apparently doesn't have enough speed for gaming, everyone's making out like it doesn't, but it's wowzers able to give, with a familiar baseline that everyone can use, the number of cores at the speed they're running at in a PS5, games are no longer held back at a CPU speed at all. All right, but that's news that nobody will let you know. And a large part of that is because there is dedicated sound hardware which frees the CPU up of having to do cool 3D sounds, right? Something that Forza on the Xbox was able, because it was a first generation game and the CPU cycles to burn, they were able to put a complex 3D engine onto the CPU so they could claim at a bullet point level, oh, we can do that as well. But when you're writing for a platform, which we haven't really seen because all the software makers wanted to release their software on both Xbox and both PlayStation, so they couldn't lean into any of the PlayStation tricks or else the game wouldn't work, well, very well at all on an Xbox. And they were getting crucified if they did it. The gaming media would come at them saying, oh, look, it runs worse on my Xbox, your development team must be shit. And the game would get boycotted, or cancel culture would do what they could to make sure that everybody knew about it, that their so-called by the spec sheet shinier Xbox wasn't outperforming a base model PS5, and they couldn't understand it. But when you've got dedicated sound hardware, which leverages lessens the need of the CPU to do complex calculations, when you've got a dedicated controller chip for your SSD drive, that frees up the CPU in ways that allows that CPU to be hyper-performant. When you've got a GPU that early Z-culls the data so you don't have to render all the polygons with light math that is landing on the other side of those trees, for example, that are in front of us right now, that frees up to 40% capability into the GPU part. And then when you've got a clever system bus re-architected so that you've got direct drive data to where it needs to get to, that also frees up CPU cycles. So there's no PC equivalent, right? The amount of extra CPU grunt that you need in a PC to get anywhere near what a PlayStation has, and that's only if you get the Pro SSD drive with its dedicated controller chip, which most people won't do if they're trying to get their PC build down in cost. Well, they generally opt for twice as much storage rather than performance storage of half the size, right? So the equivalent PC is a misnomer. It doesn't really exist. It does. You can technically buy it. If you've got a cost is no object build price point, you can build a PC that will equal, certainly outperform, a PlayStation 5 base model. But here's the catch: no one's writing software for it. Right? You're a minority machine. You are less than 1%. You are less than 0.1% of the hardware market. And you're already looking at 1/10 the sale rate of your software, basically in the PC platform, versus the console ecosystems. So why would you want to sell to 1/10 of the population by requiring a baseline, as in to actually build the software to require the features of the hardware that you are giving, right? You can't do it on PC. You can only use that extra grunt for non-game essential features, right? You can let people up the resolution, you can let people up the frame rate, but you can't require it as a gameplay feature, which on the console, you're selling high unit numbers of a stable platform, right? You will be optimized for to the middle. And this becomes a lead-in to what is PSSR 2. Any nature of upscaling technology on a dedicated console where the software programmers can write to the metal for the capability of the part with a known output requirement. For example, 4K, upscale that is, but probably 1440 is the upper base resolution. Probably 1080 to 1440 is a pretty good run area. If you aim for those resolutions and then upscale, it doesn't even have to be. If the world model is complex, a 1080 base resolution is huge. Right? People don't understand what Unreal Engine 5 was doing with hundreds of thousands of more polygons in a scene, when traditionally everything's rendered out of triangles, and triangles make round or analog surfaces very hard to render. So we used to need 4K resolution in order to make round objects kind of look almost round. But once Unreal Engine 5 with its nanite technology came to market, where the scene was composed of hundreds of thousands of more triangles, and that everything had an analog or round surface to it, you could get away with a render to the screen at 1080 resolution. And it was pretty good looking, better than what we'd had before that in 4K. Now, I do agree a sharp user interface over the top of it so that the fonts look nice is important, but semantics in a different discussion. So we'll sidestep that for a moment. But let's look about upscalers, because when you know your target, and Sony have spoken specifically with regards to PSSR 2, that the requirements of a big TV across the lounge room from you is very different to a monitor at an unknown, where you can have a variable refresh rate that might be shooting up to hundreds of frames a second, and that your target is high refresh rate at potentially a lower resolution, but at a different visual distance. You're seeking out different things in the frame to resolve, whereas very much knowing your targets, which is what the consoles have as their strong point, right? 4K 60 is the bullet point, right? Most people's TVs don't do 120 hertz, right? It is true that modern TVs can, and they offer things like variable refresh rate and offer things like 40 frames a second in a 120 hertz container, right? That's the so-called balance mode that the consoles are offering. But consoles now have the capability of hitting some pretty magic numbers, which will allow developers to tweak to the nth degree what their upscaler is doing. So this nature that DLSS is apparently better than FSR 4.1, right? You just got to understand that 9 out of 10 PC articles are written by pro NVIDIA people, right? I'm hardware agnostic. I've bought basically the best video cards by all the players, go back for many decades now. Well, I did get out of PC gaming a few years back, and out of ethics, I did move over to AMD. So that will sound like I'm biased, but I'm not really, right? I'm one of these people that's like, well, I'm using a version of ARDI a day that isn't technically getting the FSR 4.1, and that technically people want it to happen, but it's like, well, people have to understand that the PS5 Pro is once again, people think it's using RDNA 3, but it's not, because it had the machine learning of RDNA 4, it had the ray tracing of RDNA 4, right? It's another composite chip well ahead of its time. And that will give it certain advantages. And it's also got a really powerful CPU. And so you can't backport this technology to RDNA 2 cards, because to start as the cache on my card is about a third, the fourth level cache or third level cache is substantial, but the lower level caches are more important for upscale, for holding the predictive math in place, and the aspects that are needed aren't on RDNA 2. And so yes, you can. It's the whole INT8. There's a big discussion in the PC space at the moment that, look, technically you can get FSR 4.1 working on older generation cards, but right now, because Sony was decimated by a unified media front with the original PSSR release, and because of the sheer investment they've put into Project Amethyst, they need to recap. This is their crown jewel. This is what allows them to delay releasing PS6, is the strength that the PS5 Pro has in the market right now. And they need it to shine with PSSR 2. So they're not going to let that be butchered with a half-assed PC ecosystem, putting out a very unstable version of the technology, which media will crucify them, because most people aren't aligned with AMD. And all the DLSS comparisons, where they have to use various models of DLSS on a video card twice as powerful. And so some of the temporal tests will favour the higher frame rate, right? So they'll make out like it's an unbiased benchmark where they're comparing fairly, but they'll have to alternate between several DLSS models that have been custom built just to push past FSR 4, that will allow them to say, well, in this instance it's sharper, in this instance it's blah blah blah, and it's like, yeah, okay, so which consumer wants to be swapping on the fly between those models? Oh, it'll do it for me, will it? Oh, great. Now I'll actually see visual disruption to my game because my eyes are attuned to like spotting the differences. Like, it's not ideal from a consumer space, but yeah, pixel peeping. Right? I've been into high-end digital photography all my life, and if you need to zoom a shot in at hundreds of percent and train your eyes to see it and have a particular color accurate monitor and understand every aspect of the process in order to really understand, well, how much of a difference is it making? Oh, only at ISO sensitivity 800. Oh, okay, blah, blah, blah. Right? Anyone can generate a spec or a benchmark based on their biases to show exactly what they want to show. And so in that case, yes, DLSS, with its various builds, Ks and Ms and whatever else, Ls, and, you know, come up with a whole bunch of letters in the alphabet, any given one of them can technically outperform what FSR 4.1 is doing in any given sequence. But the reality is that FSR 4 has closed the gap down so much that we could, right, certainly the uneducated would easily be able to hand the win to FSR 4, right? It's closed the gap down that much that basically it's at parity to the latest DLSS models that NVIDIA has to pay bulk amounts of money for people to basically use. Right. Fortunately, the Nintendo Switch has an NVIDIA chipset in it. Fortunately, software developers now have a reason to optimize titles for DLSS outside of a few paid-for titles by NVIDIA on the PC front. Right. So Nintendo have done NVIDIA a big solid by choosing to use their hardware in their console platform. There will be enough unit sales of that programmers will have genuine incentive to support DLSS going into the future. But FSR 4 or 4.1, basically PSSR 2, is good enough to compete against the best of the DLSS ecosystem. But here's the thing, if you're a software programmer and you're programming specifically for an environment where you know the output resolution, you know the capabilities of the video card, you know the pairing of the solid-state drive and the sound chip and the buses and what they can push data-wise through a machine, and you can control every possible bottleneck to achieve suspension of disbelief with no interruption, and you know what the reserves are of any given of those systems, such as how much CPU you've got left over to burn, how much GPU memory you've still got left to allocate, you know, in every possible way. If you can build your game with suspension of disbelief so as not to reveal the hardware it's playing on, also known as gaming consoles, not the Microsoft ones potentially, but gaming consoles generally in their second and third wave titles where their heavily optimized software comes out to really show what the hardware can do. What we've seen for decades, generationally, with every console that's stuck it around for long enough to get second wave and third wave titles that are dedicated for the system. Now, I might have started giving some examples earlier in this video where I was talking about how Microsoft have been de-optimizing games. So I'm just going to run that thread out so that people aren't like, well, dude, you don't circle back and what are you, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? Like you just keep jumping around. So no, I told you it's unscripted. But, okay, so at the moment, what we've been seeing is we haven't been seeing the PS5. Now, that's the base PS5, right? The system that, it won't be until about the year 2030 that there'll be enough PCs in market with the same capabilities that game makers for the PC space will be able to lean into the types of technology that the PS5 has brought to market. Right? There's genuinely no reason to be a PC gamer if it's about gaming, right? Just to qualify, if you don't consider more frame rate and more resolution, right, the only things you're really getting in the PC space, maybe more complex light math if you're willing to spend 4 times the build cost, potentially, to get a near equal system to a PlayStation 5, certainly Pro. What Microsoft have been doing, right, to hoodwink, to get in mediocre performance, or GIMP is the acronym that I like to use there. Acronym, I think it is, not an acronym. GIMP, get in mediocre performance, right? So what all of their aligned studios, and it's not just their studios, it's the people that will get their games sold on Games Pass, right? It's all the market players that Microsoft spends big dollars to support, use support in air quotes, support in the marketplace, right? And so one of the things they've been doing is they compress the data in their games as zips. They don't use the Kraken file format, which would allow the PlayStation SSD to push bulk amount of data through in high speed. And so they choose a file size that's basically equal on any given SSD to decode. That is to say, a 4K, or a very tiny, not the resolution, 4K, 4 kilobytes, is a tiny file size that most SSDs have. It just tanks out their performance numbers for read and write. Very, very hard file size for SSDs to push, right? So if you choose the right file size such that you can basically bottleneck the SSDs to perform relatively equal, and then you make sure it's a zip, right? And so the zip, you can then use a software decompression routine, which then limits the PlayStation to not be able to use its hardware advantages. And by making the decompression run on the CPU, you can leverage the Xbox's 100 megahertz per core faster CPU. And so you can actually make it so that the read speeds are relatively equal across hardware platforms. And that, my friends, is what we've been seeing in the industry now for quite some time. So when we see games that actually lean into the Kraken format and actually use the PS5's technologies, right, they free up the CPU, they make the loading of the data much quicker, but they also allow the usage of the RAM in the machine to be very clever, because the capabilities of the PlayStation's drive is so quick that you can fill screen of data, all the textures and everything you need, and the time it takes for your character to turn around in game, you could have loaded in a fresh set of textures for everything behind you. And that is epic, right? Without having like a PC, a general PC, without it being the absolute latest cutting-edge motherboard technology, which most people won't be using, it doesn't have the capability of moving data directly to the video card or in meaningful ways that doesn't get the CPU and the buses involved in ways that bogs down the throughput or the capabilities of the machine. Right, the PlayStation 5 has an architecture that is kind of future thinking versus PCs. And there are PCs that do it, sure, but they're not 1% of the market. As in, no one is going to write PC software that requires these features. Unlike on a PS5, they can. It's a large part of why Sony probably has very little interest in bringing their future games over to PC, where they've then got to deal with tech support calls from people who have budget SSDs and can't understand why their 6-core, 12-threaded machine doesn't have any of the CPU power needed to render the game, even though they've met the minimum specs, right, that have been written fair. Otherwise, if they write them too heavily, people say, oh, these guys don't know how to write software because, look, a basic PlayStation can run it, and look what they need on a PC front to make it work. Oh, these guys are a poor studio for conversion, right? Nobody needs that smoke up their butt. It's fake. It's fake news. People don't understand the capabilities of a PS5. They are very capable, and to build a PC of equal capability to it requires spending bulk amount of money, something that Sony got down in price point because of scales of production and very clever system design in the first place. It is a unique piece of hardware, and it pushes the market forward, and it was always going to do that, and it was always going to do so until about the year 2030. And it was only if Microsoft were going to weaponize with a new console prior to that time that Sony would have to rush job, well, it wouldn't be rush jobbed, but would have to bring out a new replacement console. At the moment, it looks like they'll probably interim it with the PS6 handheld that will run the PS5 Pro games in their low power mode. And possibly, I mean, it'll have a bit more memory by the sounds of it, so they'll lean into heavier texture, and that will allow improved graphics. We'll have more impressive throughput. The bandwidth alone to the memory is a bit more powerful. But I'm getting sidetracked. It's a discussion for another video. The PS5 Pro hasn't been lent on, right? The ray tracing capabilities of the RDNA 4 parts was very strong. And the way AMD software uses the light modeling is, I believe it's hierarchically you work from the bottom up or from the top down, and the NVIDIA process is basically the opposite. So all the NVIDIA cards aren't being optimized for outside of a few studios, right? You've got to remember that the console market owns the lion's share of software sales. So if you're a studio, knowing that the consoles have the AMD chipsets in them, you're generally leaning on the AMD architectures and their tricks and technologies in order to get your game optimized. Outside of paid-for titles in the PC space like Cyberpunk, CD Projekt Red bent over heavily to be NVIDIA optimized, right? What is NVIDIA optimization? Well, I'll give you an example of Tomb Raider, a game that was built for the console first and used AMD tessellation for the snow. At the 11th hour, the optimized build for the PC had the NVIDIA optimization team come in and go, "Ooh, AMD tessellation for the snow effect? No thanks, we'll have none of that." And they pulled it out. And it meant that PCs, even with AMD cards, didn't get the benefits of what would have been console optimizations written for AMD hardware. NVIDIA do everything they can to get in mediocre performance, even if it hurts their own users, so long as it doesn't hurt their own users of the current generation. Right? They're only interested in moving you forward and selling you the new. The problem is their hardware that they're selling to is the AI market. That's why their current generation of cards lean on frame generation and upscaling, because that's them being able to leverage technology they're already building for their other market players to somehow benefit gaming. It actually means the capabilities of their current generation of cards are pretty weak compared to even the earlier generation cards before them. As someone that uses, I use an RDNA 6 series card, and its rasterization performance, which is basically every video game built in the history of gaming prior to it coming out, the older style of games rendering, right? It's the top tier card for that. There's been a couple of generations of cards newer than my card that don't have rasterization capabilities as strong or as performant. It's almost like we need different video card technologies for different eras of gaming. Now, it's not quite true. The latest 5 series of NVIDIA cards might be newer, although they say they're not going to replace these cards anytime in the next couple of years because they're not focused on gaming, right? It's not their R&D direction. So they're leveraging their AI capabilities to muster equivalents in the gaming world for the latest generational stuff, including ray tracing, which is something they've lent in heavy. And they only lent in heavy on ray tracing because AMD, trying to design the perfect video card, had pulled out ray tracing, which was a feature only needed for Hollywood. And they went, look, we're only in gaming consoles. We don't need to... The lion's share of video card development at the time was for like rendering Bugs Life, CGI movies, right? Like the large reason why video cards had certain capabilities for light math was for the capability of 3D rendering. But NVIDIA had, through driver control, and it's not quite the ECC memory versus non-ECC memory, but they'd limited their video cards so that they'd limit the floating point math to like 1/64th its capability with the consumer drivers, so they could sell video cards at 1/5 the cost to the consumer space. But the same chip would be sold to the Hollywood space to do 3D rendering. And it was always a big money-making area of their development. So when AMD realised, well, we're not winning out in this market segment, but we are in all the gaming consoles, they pulled the capability to do light math out of their die so they could build a better gaming machine. And it was with the RDNA Generation 1, it was a very capable card, but it actually got NVIDIA freaked out. And that's when they went, well, ray tracing, everything, right? What have they just pulled out of their die? Oh, okay, we'll lean heavy on that. And it was a trick they'd perfected with hairworks and various things. Oh, what's the weakest part of the AMD die? Oh, tessellation. Okay, well with all our PhysX boxes, all of our little black boxes that require software calls that we limit software developers to use with our software development kits, we lean on the weakest part of the competitor's card. So in the case of Hairworks, it was tessellation performance is weaker on the AMD card. So Hairworks requires heavy levels of tessellation in order to work, right? They don't care if they hurt their own cards, as long as they hurt the competitors' cards more. And it was something that they've been doing for many, many years in the video card market. So when ray tracing was pulled out of the AMD cards, NVIDIA made out like it was the most important thing for gaming. And so AMD had to, over a couple of generations, put ray tracing back in to their cards, which by the time they got to RDNA 4, the capabilities of their ray tracing math, very, very powerful. And again, it's what the industry is going to program for. So when we look at a PS5, which has the RDNA 4 level ray tracing capability, has the machine learning capability, that is the AI capability for upscaling of the RDNA 4 series. When we look at Project Amethyst as something that has now got very set targets in terms of PSSR2 to try to achieve, and that Sony's now got a lot of data and a lot of capability of leveraging the strengths of this technology to its absolute top-level capability, which is, as we've seen with FSR4 and 4.1 in the PC space, equal to the best of the DLSS models. PSSR2 and a PS5 Pro is the best gaming platform for many, many years ahead. Now, I say that with the qualifiers of if your time matters. if gaming isn't just about frame rate and resolution, right? Being able to turn all the features on in a PS5 Pro and have a reliable, responsive, right, no latency on the controller like Win 10 and Win 11, which gets worse with every update, right? Being able to have a responsive button press, that's irrelevant of your frame rate. You can do that at 30 frames a second. But if you've got a responsive button press and a tight render to the screen where people can't actually spot the pixels, that's suspension of disbelief achieved. And the most cost-effective way to do that is with a console. And the PS5 Pro, now that it's leveraging PSSR 2 to the market, is going to be equal or better than just about everything in the PC space. Because I assure you, those people that build budget PCs, with all their issues and all their constant breakings and all their service times required, when you build that PC, most people don't put the Bluetooth chip in and don't include a PlayStation or an Xbox controller and don't factor in the cost of a Windows license. And they don't tell you the real cost of building the PC. They don't talk about the downtime or the antivirus subscriptions that you need or any of the maintenance that you actually need to put in. And if you actually factored your time as worth anything, you could build multiple PS5 Pros and have multiple PlayStation portals and buy easily a much bigger size TV with a much better quality HDR render or OLED, right? With the money saved, you can buy a better set of headphones. And Tempest Audio is amazing, right? There's nothing in the market equivalent to it. Oh, there is actually some technology in the AMD cards that do it, but nobody writes for it because it's too small a share, right? Whereas if every single PlayStation has Tempest Audio capability and it's been enhanced in the PS5 Pro, it's Generation 4. It was first sold in the PS Vita and also in the PSVR 1. It's been evolved and evolved. And yeah, all these technologies actually being programmed for means that people get to enjoy them. And with the amount of money you save on a console versus a PC, you can buy flagship cutting-edge audio headphones or a much better TV, things that will actually make an improvement more than a frame rate that your monitor might not even render. Oh, but I bought a new monitor. Oh, good. Okay, you had to buy a new TV to make your Xbox or your PC work as intended. Okay, well, good for you. But if you buy into the PlayStation ecosystem, much like all the software developers on the planet who are now writing software for it, now that Xbox has folded, the console war has basically dropped off. All software developers will start to lean into the PlayStation architecture. They'll have to lean in heavy so they can actually look like they know what they're doing, which means now the PlayStation features will start to be used. Any of the companies that have put out Generation 1 software on the PlayStation 5 and have intended to give a good experience first time around, they will now be putting out second wave and third wave software, which means the warfare between the software houses that are now trying to put out really polished software, PlayStation games are going to start to shine. And now that there's some actual consumer metric numbers to aim for, that is possibly a lower res, lower frame rate build on the PlayStation 5. It's been established that gamers don't mind if you offer two modes, which is the 30 frames a second mode for high resolution or a 60 frames a second mode for TV resolutions that is the lion's share of the TV market, say 1080 and full high def, as we called it up until a few years ago. So, and then you've got the PS5 Pro for the people that want the 4K at the 60 frames a second. And with temporal upscaling, so FSR, PSSR 2 support will be for any game that is written with FSR 3 in mind. People are making out like it's only PSSR 2 supported titles, PSSR supported titles, but FSR 3 had temporal information in the video drivers, that is vectors, right? So if something's moving in a predictable way, they can hand that information to the video drivers where they can make predictive information about where the item will be in the next frame. And that allows super low latency frame generation, where it's generated the next frame with a very accurate hit rate. And if you do that at a high frame rate, even if there's a frame error with a pixel that shouldn't have been quite where it was, if you're at 120 frames a second, like that just won't even matter. So if they're aiming for 60 frames a second and then they use the temporal upscaling to hit 120, right, it's fair to say that we're now into an era of what will potentially be 120 frames a second gaming. But certainly 4K 60 is on the cards, and certainly 4K 60 with high levels of ray tracing if you're willing to buy a PS5 Pro. And that will give you a better experience generally than what you will find without spending about 3 times the price point or more. Now that the RAM issue has happened, you're probably at 5 times the price point to truly build a PC that would match a PS5 Pro. Now that won't be in all titles, right? Again, statistically anyone can show Oh, but what about titles that lean on old rasterization capabilities and blah, blah, blah? Oh, my PC can outperform them. It's like, yeah, true. But if you find a title that actually needs the drive throughput and actually pushes, like open world games are usually a pretty good example of that, and they'll get bogged down if they're moving lots of data constantly, and they'll really slam the CPU cores hard. And so you'll get lots of instances of people playing open world games where they're like, oh, this game's written badly. All my other games render at super high frame rate, and this one doesn't. And it's got all sorts of issues where it janks down. It's like, yeah, it's because you save money on a budget build because, Eurogamer told you that quite disrespectfully, that this budget build is in any way equal to a PlayStation 5, right, with its customized technologies. It's just not true. If you genuinely build a PC with equal capabilities to even a base model PS5, then sure, you will be able to get a higher frame rate experience at higher resolution. And you'll even be able to turn on the path tracing. I mean, if you want to spend 8 times the price point or north of 6 times the price point, you will be able to get rendering fidelity, which is, next level, apparently. But you've got to remember, the developers are going to be writing for the suspension of disbelief to be delivered by a PS5 Pro. So how much extra pixel peeping and how much misleading photographs you've got to do of specific scenes in certain sequences. Like, for example, Resident Evil Requiem, the path tracing sequences is basically the opening sequence. There's only a few spots in the game that show it off, right? Almost like an NVIDIA paid-for tech demo. It's only on the NVIDIA cards. But it's not the whole game. In fact, the lighting model gets a bit confusing, almost like the development team didn't really know what they were doing. Same as the Witcher RTX project. The original game wasn't written around real-time ray tracing, and so they used traditional lighting through the game, which looked amazing. Pre-baked lighting and just the way it all held the scene together was just lovely. And then you add RTX over the top of it, or ray tracing over the top of it, and the disjointed art output is actually quite jarring, and it's the opposite of what a more accurate lighting model should be trying to achieve. So really we're only going to see it in the consoles of a totally tied together art aesthetic built for a target output that is actually real world for people's houses. If you've got money to burn and you want to buy better, I'd say upgrade your TV or upgrade your monitor, upgrade your headphones, and buy into where a solid platform is going to exist. It's going to be delivering you a whole bunch of titles that actually achieve the promises in a very playable way. That is, buttons that are responsive when you press them. Without the frustrations, constantly servicing your machine and constantly fixing things and constantly having forced breakiness and forced downtime on you. That's not gaming. Gaming's meant to be about fun. I say this as a PC technologist of many, many years. It's made servicing computers my profession. And just like the chef that cooks gourmet food for everyone all day, when they get home, they don't want to have to tinker with their PC. They just want to turn something on and enjoy the game, right? And I can absolutely assure you that the so-called annual network cost that goes to the consoles, where you actually get a bunch of games. I mean, you probably get 2 or 3 games that are quite decent every month for 12 months. And you get to keep them. If you keep your subscription active, or if you reactivate your subscription years down the track, all the games that you've taken in the past will be there for you. And so you're actually being given games. It's a bit of a non-issue. And if you're being representative of the actual information of, yes, you do pay an annual cost to keep the network servers running, which allow the network gaming on consoles. It generally have like 10 times the player base. I say this as someone that loved playing Star Wars Battlefront, and I couldn't get a game running on the PC. I bought the Ultimate Edition from Electronic Arts, and I could not get a game running for many, 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 many hours, and asked for a refund, and they went, nah, stuff you. And I went, okay, well, you just lost a customer for life on all your other products because of treating me incorrectly. But neither here nor there. Hurt people. I'm just yelling out my misgivings. But the reality was that the player base was still like 30,000 strong on the console version of the game at that time, and so getting a multiplayer match going was quite easy. And then you've got none of the cheating. You've got equal footing for all of the players, so it's actually about skill and not who's got the more expensive build. Although, that being said, with the money you save on buying that console, you can buy a TV that's 30% larger, with more brightness or more dynamic range or more whatever, to give you a better experience. You can buy much better sounding headphones that render 3D sound around you much more accurately so that you know where the people are when they're trying to sneak up on you, etc., etc. I mean, the console is for the win. It's just a more enjoyable experience. And if that's what gaming is meant to be about, that's certainly the place to play. But PS5 is an exceptional system. And anybody that doesn't see the value, and even if at this stage of the game you could get a second-hand PS5, just a litmus test what it really is like as an experience versus even a fairly expensive gaming PC. I mean, my gaming PC has a video card that would be twice the cost of a PlayStation Pro in it, and I game on PlayStation, right? And we had multiple PS5s in the house because even the base PS5 is a superlative experience, right? And there's very few titles that support the PS5 Pro. At the moment, they're mostly Microsoft titles that generally don't support it in the slightest. They're seldom to use the adaptive triggers. The actual advantage you get with the PlayStation hardware is just phenomenal, right? If you look at the controller, there's like a microphone. Yes, there is a mic for your multiplayer gaming that's built into the controller, but there's also a speaker built into the controller. And if you use your Dolby Atmos and you've got 13 speakers around your room all positioning the audio, you've also got a point source in your hand. So you're playing Hogwarts, you cast a spell and the actual sound of the wand rips from your fingers. And that is immersive, right? And then you've got all the 3D haptics in the controller. You've got the resistive triggers in the controller. There's a lot of stuff going on you just don't get in any other ecosystem. And even if you did, the developers won't be writing for it because it's so niche. Whatever build it is that you've made is so niche, it just doesn't justify being optimized for or being written for. So just some food for thought. This is a viewpoint that nobody's giving on the internet, and that I see anytime anyone talks up PSSR2, they get slammed by 90% of the pundits who are just like, no, and no, Digital Foundry are blah, 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 and they're hardly an Xbox Pro site. That straight away tells me, oh, that's the paid-for shills that go on to spread misinformation. We have a very weird media at the moment, and again, everyone's trying to make out like PSSR titles will be a base requirement for PSSR2. That's not true at all. FSR 3, 3.1 handed over the vector data for an intelligent upscaler to make use of. So you'll actually find, my belief is, this is news before it's news, is that PSSR2 update will allow any of the titles that are written for FSR3 onwards to absolutely make use of its cutting-edge features. And it will be a toggle that's available in the dashboard of your console. You can turn on and turn off, so you can see whether it's see the enhancement or not. If for some reason it introduces a graphical issue of some sort, you can just go in and turn it off and you don't have to worry about it. But I think you'll find that this time around with the granular control, the fact that they've put it off for many months so that they can't just be outplayed at a media level by a bunch of aligned partners with the opposite ecosystem and camp, that is Microsoft. And case in point, just look at any of their games on the PlayStation Store. They list themselves as PS5 Pro enhanced, and they are so far from that. Right? There's a lot of media players that are putting out games that they're saying are PS5 Pro enhanced, and they're not. If we saw actual games that were making use of the base PS5 model, with all of its hardware capabilities, including the sound and including the drive with its fast throughput and lack of burdening of the CPU, and then if they actually leverage that CPU to be fully utilized, we would actually find out that there's enough power in a PlayStation to render incredible levels of physics. Beyond, we don't need a CPU upgrade for mass market gaming at all. But we've now got the ability for complex AI algorithms, which is a CPU heavy hitter. We've got complex physics, which is a CPU heavy hitter, and so much of the other data, such as ray tracing now, will be able to be put onto the video card, for example, with the PS5 Pro. So with the base PS5 model, they didn't technically have hardware ray tracing. They did in that AMD reorchestrated the compute units to be able to do light math, but it was very ineffective, and it meant giving up the compute units, which are traditionally used for other visual effects, to then be hoodwinked into doing a very ineffective task. So now that there's dedicated ray tracing capabilities in the PS5 Pro, it makes sense that games going forward won't lean on heavy ray tracing effects on the base model PS5, but that they can use hardware ray tracing, or that is more effective light modeling, more capable light modeling on the high-end model. So in future, we're going to see equivalent to the path tracing type light sourcing that we see on high-end NVIDIA cards. We'll see that on the PS5 Pro. We'll see the rudimentary ray tracing effects that, for example, Star Wars Outlaws did, where they did a lot of the light math on the CPU, so that the Xbox Series S, which had CPU power to burn, could still be in there with some complex light modeling, which made it look really good and really cinematic and immersive. But it is true that at the moment, it's been games like Dragon's Dogma 2, which uses a composite of ray tracing on the CPU and ineffectively on the GPU of the older generation consoles, well, the Xbox Series X and the PS5, because the compute units having to be used for ray tracing was very ineffective. It was poor use of hardware resources. And so now, pushing forward, they won't have to do that. They will be able to have a unified art aesthetic that will work on the base model console, PS5 and the PS5 Pro, getting a complex, more accurate lighting model. So the art team should be able to put out a unified, they should be able to conceive a project and it to be able to be realised. And it's certainly true that high-end PCs at 4 to 5 times the cost will be able to render an equivalent, but it will be with jank because they won't have an optimised machine. They won't have developers that can write knowing the particular tailoring of your machine, be it the speed of your RAM or the effectiveness of your buses for moving data to the video card. What sorts of caches your particular video card will have. There's just all sorts of things that just on the PC space, most people won't buy the Pro SSD drives with their dedicated controller chips. There's just all sorts of things that get in the way of having an optimized build. And that's where I think Sony are going to have a hard time with second wave and third wave titles that will be heavily optimized for a PlayStation console. If they were to bring those titles to PC, they would get crucified in the media space by people taking the attitude of, well, you need such a Ninja PC to equal a base PS5. This isn't what the mainstream Microsoft Align media partners have told me is equivalent to a PS5. This has to be poor optimization. Why is it so janky? Well, it's because you save money trying to build a PC that was only twice the cost of a PS5 Pro, and it's nowhere near the capabilities, potentially even a base model PS5 in some regards. Anyway, lots of context, lots of qualifiers, a lot of the statements I've said. Cancel culture will dictate that if there's been one thing I say anywhere through this video that has annoyed you in some way, you will want to downvote me. Obviously, there's probably some salience in a lot of the other statements, and I just seek people to be a little bit more compassionate, maybe, in their reviewing someone who's making genuine media for the right reasons, altruistic reasons, to support gaming, to support the industry as a whole. That it isn't just corporations and them paying money to media moguls to keep the oil in their wheels so that their wheels are turning in favourable ways for their companies, right? The reality is there is a market already established in front of us, and it's the media that's telling us where to look and how to look at it. And it is true that both Nintendo and Sony platforms are very pro-consumer and are exceptional value for money and are very much looking after us. And if your media outlets aren't reinforcing those statements, then I highly encourage you to be scrutinising of your points of information. But again, I put to you that I'm just a regular Joe Blogs that's out here doing it for the right reasons, out of compassion, out of the concept of brotherhood of man. I hope that's not a sexist term, but the humanity. Nonche, I don't know. I've been watching Resident Alien. I think it's a great little show. The concept of we the people, right? It's kind of important at this stage in history, and it is so easy for AI journalism to just turn out 10 times more media that isn't serving us. And so maybe be compassionate with the people that are on your side, even if the information I present to you isn't favourable due to the misinformation you've been told and the investments you've made because of misinformation. Again, I've been a PC gamer most of my life. The cost of my PC gaming build is a couple of times the price of a PS5 Pro. I had to do that with a lot of second-hand parts and a lot of very knowledgeable decisions for refining and finding the right parts to achieve that build. It is true that I generally have none of the bottlenecks and frame jank that other people claim in just about all their games. And I can get away with a platform that in many ways is very, very many years old versus the standard platforms that people are using out there right now. And I find I have a superlative experience with PC gaming. But you couldn't pay me, you couldn't twist my arm hard enough to basically be in that ecosystem for my entertainment, because I like my free time, my game time, to be exactly that. It is meant to be free gaming time to be enjoyed, for which, for the masses, the consoles really are where it's at, and it's usually at this stage in their time frame. Irrelevant of what the media is now trying to promote to you, that they're saying it's a silly time now to buy into the console generations. It's actually not true, and that's been true for every console ever released, is that it's towards the end of their lives. They generally put out the third wave titles that are super optimized for the silicon, and they start to really show what they're capable of doing. And look, there is a lot of salient facts in this video that I think if you reach into your soul and try to feel what's true here, you'll come to recognise that what I'm saying is based on the wisdom of ages, and that someone that's been gaming since the Atari 2600 wood grain, the 70s version. I've certainly imported a lot of gaming consoles. I've played on just about every platform that's ever come out, and certainly played a lot of the gaming systems of games over time, and experienced multi-wave titles from studios, highly optimised CD-ROM titles, because NEC and the TurboGrafx/Super Graphics CD-ROM showed me what it could do before the PC attempted CD-ROM titles, for example. You play a game like Ys, Book 1 and Book 2 on TurboGrafx CD-ROM. That was an 8-bit console system. And that thing there could show you what anime overlays over an animated screen could do, and just, oh my lord, good games development does exist. And if you've got an eye for it and you recognise it when you see it, it's mad to think that the original Crysis that ran at absolute ultra settings on a video card with 5% of the capabilities in terms of grunt. If I look at a modern spec sheet, the measurements of my current video card versus what Crysis ran on originally, which I ran at ultra settings back in the day, that with 5% of the capability, and it ran at ultra, now on my machine, if I was to run a version of Crysis, or ideally not Crysis remastered, I certainly wouldn't see a 95% increase in performance throughput. And it is totally true that our architectures need to be optimized for in order to see said results. And so when you look at a game like Hogwarts Legacy on PS5 Pro, it's outstanding versus the equivalent PC cost you would have to spend to make use of things like the Tempest Audio. And again, the controller sound, like being a point source in your room, is just blending with your surround sound system just epically in a way that we don't see in multi-platform releases coming to all platforms, right? So we do need to see software being optimized. And I know that even when I got access to upscaling tech through my AMD video card, that trying to achieve an upscaled to 4K resolution, and I always used in the benchmark, there was a birdcage in Hogsmeade Village, and to try to get the resolution on that as good as what I can achieve on the console, or the grand staircase in the castle, to get with its jag-free edges on it, basically to achieve the pure resolution that the console is achieving. It takes many, many years of PC tuning and tweaking and really knowing what you're doing and overclocking your video card to the absolute top level, and then playing with beta drivers and all sorts of nonsense and trickery to get at best at parity to a budget console that costs a third to a quarter the cost. So, look, the dialogues in the media are very misrepresentative of what's really going on and where real fair value is. I think that the truth is that the powers that be are genuinely scared at the capabilities and the long legs that are about to be given to the PS5 console now that there's no competition to it, such that the software that's being written for it will become a competitive ecosystem, and second wave, third wave titles will start to really shine and actually use the hardware that we've been given. We have had it now for a few years, sure, but there's very few examples of software that are using the hardware well. And that now changes. At wave 2, wave 3 software titles is when it really will start to come together. And so it's a silly time to try to port those games that will be heavily optimized for that PlayStation console to PC. And that won't just be from Sony first party. That will be from a lot of companies. And rather than dealing with a percentage of people constantly coming at them saying, oh, this isn't well optimized and this isn't good and we've got lots of issues and you've got to waste lots of staff time dealing with us having issues with our PCs, nobody wants that. There's a reason why 4 or 5 of the major PC manufacturers on the planet are all now shipping Linux PCs as a large part of their sales force, because they don't want their quality assurance and their call centers absolutely bogged down with just general Windows troubleshooting type issues and just random PC-ness and forced driver updates, right? So, yeah, I mean, if you're a serious PC gamer, Gamers Linux France, GLF Linux, that'll get you up and running. It's super easy to install. That's another video. I've done videos on that. I think it's wonderful. I'd recommend that to anyone, and that will get away from a lot of bugbears that you could have on the PC ecosystem. The best way to make use of Linux is to be with an AMD video card. You'll just get better driver support. They're very much open market. They're very much they give a lot of technologies to the market for free. AMD have been very pro-consumer for decades, and they're doing the right thing by everyone. Again, don't believe what the media tell you. trying to, justify their silly purchases, possibly recommended by their IT person who's generally been an NVIDIA person for many, many decades. So, I mean, NVIDIA will get some Linux drivers. They're putting job listings out for Proton development and improved driver support in Linux. Certainly now the market is moving very strongly to the Linux ecosystem. That will be a requirement for them if they want to hold their market share. But, I mean, it basically had to be forced on them. And so AMD are already ready doing it. And so where an AMD card might punch 20% lower in performance than an NVIDIA card that costs 10-20% more, in the Linux ecosystem it'll be 20% more performant. And you will have saved 20% money, which is money towards either a monitor or a TV upgrade or a sound system upgrade or money in the bank for your next video card at a more regular upgrade cycle, right? So I don't know. Gaming doesn't have to be super expensive. Anyone's making out like the cost of gaming has just become super expensive because AI data centers are sucking up all the primary resources needed for making these things happen. Yeah, that's a fact. But Sony had a stockpile of RAM such that they can they can sell their consoles possibly for the most part of this year without inflating the prices, which means it's never actually been cheaper. A time frame to get in with a budget console ecosystem and to get top tier levels of gaming quality and performance in a stable and reliable way. Anyway, I say thanks for coming along. It looks like we got all the way to the end of our video. We didn't have any technical hiccups, is my belief. And so I just say maybe it was meant to be. Look, if you found this video in any way infotainment, or if you're using it as a way to justify your PlayStation purchase to your PC friends, by all means, feel well. Something I never do on this channel is say, oh, share this video. I don't say share this video, but by all means, you can point them to this video to be schooled, if you will. This is information you won't find just about anywhere else. So by all means, if they need a source of the information that might have justified your purchase, if you were suffering buyer's remorse, or qualified your purchase if you're at all on the fence and needed an alternative opinion to get you over the line, by all means, send them along and we can have a discussion. Alrighty, well wishes with you. You have a good one.